Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome back to the MineWarp podcast. Thank you for giving us your time and your attention again. I really appreciate it. And of course, this is the podcast where we talk about all things new in mining and mining technology and so on. And of course, we talk with the people who bring us the technology as well as the people who use that technology. I call them the innovators and the implementers of the technology. And today, we have one of the implementers that we are talking to. So our guest today is Josh Goveia. I hope I didn't murder that completely, Josh, your surname. But yeah, Josh is at First Quantum Minerals in Zambia, and he is acting manager, tailing storage facility and water dams. But as we just talked about earlier, that's a role for now. But he's an engineer at heart and also a scholar at heart, and he loves to learn and loves to bring new thinking into his job and into the industry as well. And so he's a very interesting person, or at least I think so, and I'm sure you'll find him to be as well. Welcome to the MineWarp podcast, Josh.
Thanks very much for having me, Empie. I think it's an absolute honor and privilege. We've spoken at length before, so I'm hoping that your viewers and your listeners will take away something from this conversation, and hopefully it will at least, at the very least, give them something to think about.
Yeah, that's right. What I liked about, and as you just said there, we have spoken at length a few times before, but what I liked about our conversation is that we didn't really only talk about nice new tools or new functions or this and that, but also about the human side and the I would say the spirit behind innovation and the environment that is conducive to innovation and making innovation stick at mines and so on. So those are all topics that we're both really interested in. And I can't wait to get to that. But before we do, as we always do, let me give you a minute or so to introduce yourself to our listeners. Please, Josh, go ahead.
Thanks, Empie. So my name is Josh, for those of you that are now listening. I have had a fairly interesting career. It's a non-sort of traditionalist career. I'm Zambian born, South African educated. I've had a career rather that is spread over two specific countries. So I've worked in South Africa and I've worked in Zambia. I've worked both in the underground and the open cast environments or surface environments. And along the journey, it's sort of been a journey of discovery for me. Along the journey, I've developed this passion for integration and this passion for an understanding of what I call the humanocentric view of mining. We've, in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, we've really seen technologies come to the fore. We've seen operational technology become almost ubiquitous with most mines. But sometimes almost at the expense of what drives the mines. And to me, that's underlying, at least. It's the people behind them. So that's really a little bit, it's a very, very short, succinct way of describing me. I'm someone who has a real deep interest in people, but at the same time, I sort of really want to understand what that congruence is between people, technology, and ultimately the environment. So that's a little bit of a blurb.
Yeah.
I've been with First Quantum for probably the better part of 4 years now, and they're a great company to work for. And one thing that they recognize is, just sort of leading on from the conversation that we're having a little bit earlier, is they recognize that we don't need to necessarily box ourselves into any particular field or subfield, which has been really advantageous for me. So I started my First Quantum career specifically in the production environment, and I started really sort of dabbling with data and load and haul optimization. I then served operational functions in the mine itself. And my most recent transition, which has probably been one of my most exciting ones, has been onto the back end of the process system in the tailing storage facility. It's an incredibly interesting journey for me over the last sort of 3 months or so. I've learned a hell of a lot. I have a good friend of mine, Reese McGrath. He sort of adopts this approach of the 100 days when it comes to something new. It takes like a sort of a 100-day sprint. And it's something that I learned quite early on in my career from him, that I've also started to use. So I spent the last 100 days, as it were, learning and doing as much as what I can as it relates to tailings,
Right.
That fortunately has meant that I probably had to spend as much time on my my learning as what I did in my PhD, but it's proven beneficial. So it's an exciting role, and I think it's a very topical role at the moment, particularly when you think of where the industry has gone and where it's come, or where it's going rather, and where it's come from. And that specifically is more related with governance and best practice than it is with anything else. If you sort of consider where we were 10 years ago in the Brumadinho disasters and some of the South American sort of challenges and pitfalls we had seen with specific relation to the TSS, I think the industry has now realized that perhaps we had it wrong as it relates to governance and risk practices. And so you've seen that sort of promulgate in the form of new regulatory frameworks like the Global International Standards of Tailings Management, which is ultimately what the major drive is for most larger operators, is how do we protect our tailings facilities, not only from a stability and seepage point of view, but how do we maintain continuity right through to closure? And I think that's been probably my most interesting learning experience in the last 3 months or so. So I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, and it does seem to be quite a regulated environment, right? The whole TFS environment. And I don't know a heck of a lot about it, but as you say, there's been so much in the news lately about that. And unfortunately, companies have been closed as a result of non-compliance or worse, as a result of incidents related to TFSs. And so it's quite a high risk environment where if things go wrong, it often isn't limited to a local area. It can have catastrophic environmental and people impact, right?
Absolutely. There's so I always sort of, if you wanted to break it down sort of statistically or mathematically, if you wanted to be succinct about how you would describe it, it's a low probability but high impact event. If we look at tailings risk. And how your governance procedures and your regulatory frameworks that guide you and how you manage those risks ultimately dictate, the efficacy, right? So that's the nice thing I would say about frameworks like GISTM is that they provide us a framework. If you take it back to South African terms, if you travel from Johannesburg to Cape Town, there's about 3 or 4 different ways that you can drive, right? You could take the N12 through Kimberley. You could take the N1 through Bloemfontein and a couple of other regional routes, right? But ultimately, there's 4 different ways. And that's really what some of these frameworks, largely around the TSF, but also in mining, allow us the opportunity to do. They say, these are your guardrails, and you can sort of forge your own journey. And I think that there's some real beauty in that discovery, number one. And number two, I really think it allows us sort of the freedom as operators to be able to manage our operations from a risk-based approach that is localized and specific. The environment jurisdictionally that we operate within the SADC is vastly different to what they would operate in Australia, albeit the tailings facilities from a design point of view are very similar. There are other nuanced contexts that also go into their governance procedures and how they are managed that are different.
So, we can go into, and we have to go into that in a little bit more detail, but I want to just bring it back to you personally. One of the things that caught my eye, I'm always looking for interesting people to talk to, and that caught my eye about your LinkedIn profile, and well, I guess, looking at your education on there. I've got to read this to people. Firstly, if this is in sequence, an advanced diploma in business project management from the University of Cape Town, and then BEng mining engineering from the University of Pretoria, my alma mater. Then University of South Wales, an MSc in hold on to your seats, psychology, Mr. Engineer, go figure. And then from the University of Johannesburg, PhD in engineering or industrial management. I mean, Josh, what's going on? Can't you decide, or do you just love everything?
It's funny you bring that up, and people that really sort of deeply know me know that I'm not haphazard. I'm not absent-minded. I do admittedly have a bit of a short attention span, and I'm quite comfortable to say that. However, it's very strategic. There's a very sort of
Okay.
defined reason that I follow that path, and that's very simply, mining is complex, man. And it's not just about one singular element, right? I've ultimately, those qualifications have been the segues into particular fields within the mining value chain, one, and two, have oftentimes been the outputs that have driven a desire that has been at least underpinned somewhat by real world experience. And so, like if you speak to the doctorate, for example, I mean, it's sort of the culmination of everything that's built up to it. So if you think about what I mentioned a bit earlier, is that I have a deep interest in a deep rooted interest for people. I'll take it slightly back to the very early stages of my career. I started out in the underground mines, in the underground platinum mines, specifically in the Rustenburg and Brits area. And I had sort of this interesting juxtaposition between sort of traditional and conventional stoping and mechanized mines. And I figured that there was a distinct difference, particularly from an operational point of view, in what those outputs were. But ultimately, there was a commonality that was often overlooked, and that was that people were still in control. And as I sort of grew on in my career, I later went on to the coal mines, and I later went on to the diamond mines, and I later moved to Zambia. And as I sort of developed and moved on in my career, there was something that just sort of stuck with me the whole way. And that's, my worldview is informed very much from a sort of Judeo-Christian background. But I had this deep-rooted desire to try and understand people. So in as much as I'm an engineer, and as much as I love systems thinking, and I love technology, and I love critical thinking and solving problems, I am at heart a people's person.
Okay.
And that's really sort of where that journey unfolded and informed, to a large degree, 5 years of really, really hard work, man. It was blood, sweat, and tears to obtain that PhD. But I've poured my heart and soul into that, and it should reflect at least somewhat in the pages for anyone that reads it. But it's ultimately, mining is it's really defined as a socio-technical system, if you wanted to be academic about it. It's very simply put, it's the combination of people, of technologies, and sub-environments, right? Whether those are regulatory informed, whether those are informed by operating jurisdictions, but ultimately it's people and equipment and technology. That's really what it boils down to. And we often optimize, particularly with the advent of autonomous technologies and how some operators are pushing that. And that's perhaps a good segue into the next bit of the conversation. Particularly with automation, we've oftentimes overlooked the person behind the controls. And I think there's some interesting context jurisdictionally that we should unpack at least. And if we're going to be intellectually honest with ourselves, we do need to unpack that there's differentials across different operating jurisdictions, and automation is not a fits all. And that's really what it is, man. It might look strange, but it's very, very, very pointed and very deliberate in what I've done.
I spoke with or I had a podcast episode with another engineer, Empie Strydom from Wartsila, and he is an electrification specialist, right? And he also talked about this jurisdictional, as I should say, the differences, and how what may be obvious and useful in one jurisdiction must be approached completely differently in another jurisdiction, because technology always runs in the context of people, and so on. I want to call him well, of course he was a colleague, but also a friend and a mentor, Mike Woodall, and he was a mining engineer that we worked together many, many years, and he always used to remark about this phenomenon that he sees. You go to implement some technology at a mine, whatever it is, right? And you get the mining engineer who's there. He is 2 years from retirement. And one mining engineer that's 2 years from retirement says, man, I've only got 2 years. Just leave me alone for a little bit. Go and implement that the tech somewhere and let me go quietly. And then the other one, same situation, says, you know what? I've only got 2 years left to make a difference. Let me get stuck in and see how I can kind of use the last bit of energy and knowledge and skill that I've accumulated and make this the my swan song that really makes a difference. So, people make a difference, team make a difference, company culture makes a difference.
Absolutely.
And of course, regulatory, structures and frameworks makes differences, and so on. And so it's really not that strange, or it shouldn't be that strange, to have the kind of academic journey that you have taken, because they completely go together. Understanding the core of mining, understanding the kinds of approaches to technology and technology adoption, understanding people, and I think the industrial engineering angle that you've got there. I uh, I'm no industrial engineer, so I can't be personally biased, but it just seems to me like such an incredibly useful qualification. Looking at the world through a process lens and through an optimization lens, and you've had quite a journey in optimization and business improvement yourself, haven't you?
Yes, that's right. Just take it sort of two steps back there, is that
Mm,
the entire journey has been informed again by sort of an empirical basis, right?
okay.
It's been informed by real world observation, and I think that's a distinction from sort of traditionalist academia. And I've often been asked from people that don't know me, so Josh, are you a researcher or are you an operator?
Okay.
Are you an implementer? Are you a boots on the ground guy, or are you someone that sort of gets stuck and bogged down in academia? And the reality is, if I must be honest, I'm a bit of both.
Yeah, the answer is yes.
The answer is unequivocally yes. I'm a bit of both. But what
Yeah.
the interest, and I suppose really that the outputs as a result of some of those have not only been informed by real world observation, and I'm a big fan of the observational approach to research, but certainly the fundamental outcomes and outputs have rounded me and have developed things that are practically and pragmatically useful in my day to day.
Mm,
And you speak about the industrial engineering as an example. I think it's probably the most underrated form of engineering. And the reason that I
mm,
say that, and if you look, there's like a disproportionate number of sort of traditionalist engineering streams: mechanical, aerospace, chemical, electrical, etc. I mean, if you really had to sort of bundle all of those up and compare them, industrial engineering in the modernized sense that we understand it, which is sort of from a systems perspective, is
mm,
actually a very small cohort. But the reality is
mm,
that they're probably the most useful.
mm.
And I can say that because I'm an engineer, and we should consider ourselves engineers. We shouldn't necessarily consider ourselves by the prefix to that, right? The reason that I say that is because there's a strong application for their outputs and how they
Right.
approach problem solving
Mm,
across different dimensions.
mm, mm,
If you look at like a linear programming perspective, and we were talking about that a little bit earlier, a traditionalist engineer from a mechanical background, let's say, has never really had exposure to that kind of thing. But I can sure
mm,
as hell bet that an industrial engineer would have.
mm,
Um,
mm,
and ultimately, mining it's a socio-technical system being sort of the key and an important word there. It's the operative word. And we should approach it just as such. Now, how you approach it from an inputs point of view and from sort of an
mm,
optimization or a business improvement point of view is slightly different. It can, again, because there are nuances between people and technology and equipment and process. But really, you're trying to objectively optimize particular sub areas and particular sub
mm,
criteria by whatever that sort of objective function is.
mm,
And
mm.
that's really, I suppose, a very long-winded way of explaining what I'm interested in and a little bit about me professionally.
Let me ask you a bit of a technical question about linear programming, because it is interesting to me as well. You've got your decision variables and what you want to determine and so on, but you've got that objective function which kind of uh, axiomatically assumes that there is a linear relationship between the various
Mhm.
items that you are considering.
Yeah. And oftentimes you
And
find there aren't.
and that's my question. So,
Oftentimes you find there aren't. Models
yeah,
are all
is it realistic, or is the relationship between things so warped by people and approaches as opposed to systems only, that it's hard to use linear programming as a real tool in real mining sites.
Explicitly and exclusively, I think the application is probably more academic than it is pragmatic, right? So here's again one of the long-winded answers. I would say it depends. It depends on a number of different things, and these usually, it usually does boil down to that same answer across a number of different dimensions. Technology adoption, for an example, it depends. In terms of mathematical modeling, it's probably one of the most appropriate. Because in my mind, at least, you have, let me put it slightly differently. All models are wrong until they aren't, right? And ultimately, I think that if you look at the mining value chain as a sort of from a holistic perspective, a lot of the catchphrases and buzzwords that have been used historically are mine to mill, as an example. If you look at it as a real sort of holistic value chain, I would argue that linear programs specifically, and if it's multi-objective in nature, is probably the most appropriate mathematically. It doesn't necessarily mean that the outputs are the most pragmatic. So again, there's that sort of nuance, right? And I think that you've touched on a key point there. One of the things that I think is either a make or break is an understanding of the modeling itself, but really data without decision is just a pretty front-end dashboard, right? You could be solving for a particular objective function, but if you don't have a policy that underpins it, then it's useless. Then it doesn't matter how mathematically robust it is. If you're not acting on it, and this is typically where we see some of the pitfalls in data analytics come into play, is we're data rich but knowledge poor. Data must always be informed by policy. And if I don't have, let's take it to a very sort of practical scenario, right? If there's a particular set of short-term interval control metrics that we have the mathematical underpinning of how we've arrived at those metrics is somewhat irrelevant in this context of the conversation. But let's say there are a bunch of metrics that we want to optimize for. If the guy in the dispatch center doesn't understand what levers to pull based on the upwards or downwards trending movements of said metrics, it's useless.
So this brings me to something that I've been thinking about a bit in the context of where AI is going and so on. There's this tension between the is and the ought. All right. Now this brings my personal philosophy a little bit into it. If you extrapolate data, you are essentially working with the is, right? And you need some external, as you just mentioned, a policy or a value or some overarching principle that says this is the ought that you got to bring into it, and that's the understanding that maybe the human has in the control room that you're referring to, or the learning that the AI engine has, or something like that. But how do you move from this is all my data, and without that purpose behind the data, it's really just noise. It's just noise.
It's data. It's numbers on a spreadsheet or numbers on a CSV file or digits in a SQL database.
So how do you move from that, which you can use in machine learning to extrapolate where things are going and to maybe predict and to simulate outcomes and so on, to building in values and making decision or judgment decisions on data without or in the season where, as you just said, autonomy, and now it's autonomy plus AI, is starting to play such a big role.
I have a really good friend that works out of our London office. He's a guy by the name of Ron Smith, and he and I share a similar view on this. And I'll answer you succinctly for once. I won't do the long-winded view.
I don't believe you, but go ahead, please.
You do it as a phased approach, Empie, and it's on a case-by-case basis. So particularly, like, how does any sort of data development really start? There's an underlying problem, and there's a group of people, most typically engineers, that gather around a table and say, this is a problem for our business, and we have an intended outcome. Again, back to sort of that objective function, right? we have an intended outcome that is desirable for us. This has a punitive effect at the current at this sort of current state.
Right.
And typically how it starts is you solve for a problem, and then you realize, well, oh, flip, okay, that actually worked. And then it's the next phase, and then it's the next phase, and suddenly it becomes this entire journey where you're developing a pipeline, and you're doing a full stack data development for a massive mining company. And that's sort of how I see it. It's very organic in nature, and most
Yeah, but I mean, you use the term "it actually works."
it does.
Works for what?
Sticks.
You know, so let me expand. If tonnage, throughput, and yield is the ultimate goal, and it overarches everything, then you're going to have production or you might have production at the end of at the expense of safety, as an example.
Yeah,
all right.
absolutely.
So you balance the one with the other, and now you've got production, and you've got safety, and you've got people. You know, and you've got to balance all of those as variables into your function, and then you've got to ask yourself, in our company, in our country, which one weighs most? You know, I've been to Russia many times, and you see people sitting at the bottom of long escalators, watching screens, or you see people in little glass, I don't even know what pods next to road intersections, changing the traffic lights manually, because the value is employment in that case. Right.
Yeah.
So there are external values that has a determinant influence on what is deemed to be it works or not.
And I would take that a step further to say that's defined at a global scale. So that's typically jurisdictionally, which is somewhat driven sociopolitically, depending on where you operate, whether it's in South America or in Africa, etc. And then there's a level below that, and that's at the organizational level. And then there's probably a level below that too, and that's at the departmental or individual level. Like, what is your HOD's propensity for data informed decision making? You know, you spoke to the guy that's the traditionalist mining engineer that's only got 2 years left to retirement. Well, I would argue that he's probably just wanting to sort of kick the can down the road until he gets his pay package. You know, so I think it is complex, and I think that there are some mines that do it fairly okay. I don't think anyone does it brilliantly, and I think that we probably got a lot of lessons to learn and leverage from other industries that do it well. Sort of the automotive industry is probably a good example of that, right? Just to get back to the sort of the data journey in and of itself, I think you're right in saying that it should be informed by some set of common values. And any sort of mine and organization that has a desire to move that down that direction needs to be able to define those up front, because, you know, sans the definition, you're not going to get to the intended outcome. And I think it's very key to have that definition of what drives it and what those values are up front, right the way, top down, bottom up. It needs to be common, not only amongst the visionaries, but certainly among the implementers. And then I would take that a step further and say it needs to be common among the adopters. You know, implementation without adoption is also just, it's a hurdle. It's a roadblock. It's a dead end.
Yep. You've been involved in quite a few technology projects. Let's maybe bring it to closer to technology. And some have worked and some have not. Or I should say maybe some have stuck, as you just said, and some haven't. What, in your estimation, was the biggest driver behind successful adoption of technology?
People.
Yeah.
People usually is. Or people usually are, rather, and that's a very succinct answer, but I believe it sort of emphatically. I can say that vehemently. You know, you can have the same systems, the same operational technology, the same implementation roadmap, and this sort of speaks to the importance of not having a one fit wonder type approach. But the one dynamic that's different across two of the same sorts of implementation or operating technology implementation roadmaps are the people who are driving them, not only from the actual drive perspective, the people that are implementing, but certainly then the people that are adopting them too. And again, I sort of come back to this data without decision policy type understanding. You've got to be able to have people who not only believe in the data, there's got to be some underlying and intrinsic confidence in what the data is saying. I think that's important. But if that's proven, then you have to be able to have, what's important rather is people that then act on it. And oftentimes we're in reflecting on my own personal failures, sort of trying to put two different scenarios juxtaposed to each other. Perhaps one, we've had more influence in actually getting buy-in from the front, like right up front, and others perhaps not. Things like that make a big difference, and it ultimately it comes down to the people that are going to use it, will use it, and will continue to use it. Because you can also have some level of adoption, but adoption doesn't necessarily guarantee sustainability and continuity. And that's important.
I spoke with a technology CEO just last week. I'll not mention the name for the moment, although you will know. And we specifically talked about how hard it seemed to us to get technology to stick in Zambia, where you are working. And we talked about some of the problems that we saw was the fact that the companies are go through ownership cycles very quickly, or I should say the mines. So there's a bit of, so what? Why should I really give this attention? Because 2 years from now, the mine will be owned by someone else, and their objectives again will be different. And then secondly, there is the come and go of people. You've got expats, and you've got a variety of people that come. And this guy is excited about something. He convinces management to invest in it, and then goes for it, with all the energy that he has, and does so well that he gets a promotion, and he's gone. And now what now? Who then takes it over? Is that something that you think is fairly typical of the region that you're in? Of course, not unique, but typical. And if so, then what advice do you give to mining CEOs, I should say technology CEOs, like the one I was talking to say, this is how you should approach mines in Zambia to make your tech work?
I would extend it actually to the broader SADC, because I don't think that it's only exclusive. I think it's common to probably all of the countries within the SADC, probably proportionately more in Zambia. But I would answer you by saying this.
Just for those people outside of Africa, what is the SADC?
Southern African Development Community.
Right, there you go.
So I would answer that by saying one thing. Is don't put all your eggs in one basket. And oftentimes we do. We have like a site champion. We sort of leverage and we invest significantly in them, and then they go. And that's not, it's not unique to Zambia necessarily, but it probably is in a sense that, we, as you said, there's some added complexities around sort of the employment splits between different demographics, from expats to nationals, etc. And the reality is that you're trying to build continuity, and continuity is the most important thing other than the initial front-end buy-in, because buy-in is not hard, but it's also not easy, right? The harder part is, like you said a little bit earlier, is getting it stick. And getting it stick, for lack of a better word, is really sort of about the promotion of continuity. Continuity is never guaranteed if you don't have a successor. And it's not just, so there's two parts in the ownership cycle there. There's the first part where, the site champion, as it were, has some level of ownership to actually conduct a proper handover. And then the second part is, the technology company who's the vendor, for lack of a better word, also has a significance to play there. And that's, really, if you want to ensure that your brand sticks, outputs themselves dwindle. Outputs themselves, if they're not immediately visible, don't necessarily matter. And I think that continuity is promoted through visibility, and visibility is important. That's what I would say.
That's excellent. So, Josh, let's talk about your new role. We are fast running out of time here, but anyways, let's talk about your new role and tailings storage and the risks behind it and so on, and maybe the application of technology there. I have a good friend who runs a company that does survey of tailing storage facilities and dams and so on for mines in Africa, and it's a massively growing technological world. What are you running into? What's new? What's exciting in that world?
There's quite a great deal, and I think that if you look at it from a sort of early warnings perspective, there's a hell of a
Hmm.
lot of technology that's available in the current market. I mean, traditional standpipe piezometers are being replaced by vibrating wire piezometers that have transponders that can push out data and be ingested into any sort of cloud host facility um, out of wherever.
Mm.
So I think there's a lot of, from a hardware point of view, there's a lot of interesting new developments. The use of fiber optic cable, the use now of satellite imagery and
Mm.
INSAR, as an example. From a hardware perspective, there's a lot.
Mm.
I am more interested in how those sort of congregate and what the congruence is of the data, right?
Mm.
In other words, is there an opportunity to create through a common data model
Mm.
the ability to have some level of predictive analytics? And I don't
Mm.
know if there's a couple of vendors out there. It's probably about, I mean, in my own research, probably about 6 to 9 different vendors that are trying to sort of collect and collate this data to be able to have some level of predictive analytics.
Mm.
Do they do it well? I think some do some things well and others do other things better. For the
Mm.
most part, there are one or two parts of those programs and how they approach the understanding structurally that are maybe a bit clunky. But the real exciting opportunity, I think, as it relates to data technology and the integration of those two on tailings and dams is in not only predictive analytics, but certainly in the future, some level of prescriptive analytics. So in other
Right.
words,
Okay.
it comes back down to data without decision, right? So
Mm. Mm.
what are you ultimately trying to achieve? You're trying to create a decision. We
Mm.
take it a step back and we sort of discuss early warning systems as an example. Not all movement and displacement within the embankment of a starter wall is bad. Some of it's very
Okay.
natural. So, I
Mm-hmm.
mean, how do you, one, filter out some of that noise? Two, understand that there is some level of relationship, perhaps it's a non-linear relationship, which is, again, where some of the mathematical modeling is important. But, how do you understand the relationship between displacement and potential failure? And what other
Okay.
attributes are sort of intertwined and interconnected in that produce some form of outcome, right? Because the
Mm.
outcome must be, do I evacuate people or do I not? What's that trigger action response plan? And I think
Mm.
that to me is probably the most exciting part of where tailings management and risk governance within the tailings perspective is going. If you had to ask me, I would say that it's probably it presents itself the largest data set, because it's all sort of time series data,
Mm.
right? So,
Mm.
like from a frequency of measure point of view, it's probably presents the largest data set along the mining value chain. But certainly, to me at least, the most significant opportunity, because you have some level of ability to overlay multiple different measures on a common measurement scale, and that's time.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I'm particularly excited at that, or about that rather. I'm particularly excited where tailings are going as it relates to Internet of Things, and
Right.
how we can get to a space where we have not only reactive level data analytics, but certainly some level of predictive analytics, and then ultimately, the end goal utopia for 90% of operators out there is prescriptive analytics.
Prescriptive. Yeah.
There's multiple different ways that you can skin this cat, and I think that there's a lot of people that have tried this through machine learning. There's a
Mm.
couple of guys that have been trying this through structural modeling, but no one really has that. No one has had the monopoly on like point to point, and
Right.
I think that to me there's a significant opportunity there.
Sounds good. Um, we always close with bringing the conversation back to a bit of a personal angle, and you and I share some of that in the sense that, or where I want to take it, that we are both Christians, and so we approach our work from that perspective. And
Absolutely.
it informs not only what we how we do our work, but also what we consider to be the good and the beautiful, so to speak. So let me ask you this in closing then. Um, do you think the mining industry is moving uh, into a better space, or into a more exploitative space, or is it going backwards, or is it going forwards when it comes to what is really important, namely having people live the purpose that they were made for?
Yeah. Look, I'm always going to give you the ever opportunist answer here, right? And that's sort of formed by the ideological background. But I wouldn't be in the mining industry if I wasn't excited about it. And I certainly think that as an industry, we're doing a hell of a lot to promote not only that sense of purpose, but certainly engage in this collaborative environment where people are at the center. Now, again, to speak to the particular company that I work for, we adopt it from that perspective. But I think that overall, sort of as a general overarching answer, I think the industry is moving towards that. And the reason is, it's becoming more important to have social license to operate. And we see that in a lot of mines today that are being taken over, nationalized, that aren't getting EIAs approved. Social license to operate is becoming more and more important. And I think companies are adopting that almost from an altruistic perspective, and understanding that what got them here won't necessarily get them there. And we realize that our most sort of fundamental underlying important asset are the people that not only we operate within or use to operate within local jurisdictions, but certainly the people that are touched and impacted by our operations. So yeah, I'm very positive about where we're going. Some do it better than others, of course, as it always is. It's never a hard and fast case. But I'm very excited for where the industry is going, and it's certainly one that I'm glad that I'm part of.
Yeah. So, Josh, thank you for playing that role, and thank you for being on the MineWarp podcast. I certainly enjoyed the discussion. I'm hoping that we can do more of these.
Thanks very much, Empie. I appreciate it. And to your viewers and listeners, I hope that is something that you're able to reflect on as to